On a cold morning in Lower Manhattan, men with clipboards walked block by block through Radio Row, marking doors for demolition. Store owners begged for time, for compensation, for mercy, and the answer was paperwork. David Rockefeller and the Port Authority sold the plan as salvation for a fading financial district. But the trade was brutal. A living neighborhood erased to build two towers so vast they struggled to fill their own floors. Years before September 11th, the complex was already bleeding money, drawing lawsuits, and suffering fires and crime. So why did New York hate the Twin Towers, and who refused to listen? The neighborhood that had to die. Before the towers rose, there was a maze of shops and voices, and a map that decided they would vanish. Radio Row was not elegant. It sprawled across 13 blocks of Lower Manhattan like a living argument against city planning. The street smelled of solder and coffee. Windows displayed radios stacked to the ceiling, television sets still warm from testing, and amplifiers whose dials caught the afternoon light. Men stood in doorways smoking, calling out prices to passers-by. Inside, narrow aisles wound between shelves of vacuum tubes, coils of wire, transformers salvaged from who knows where. The businesses had names that told their own stories: Harry's Radio, Cortlandt Electronics, the Terminal Radio Corporation. Some had been there since the 1920s, when radio itself was new and the neighborhood invented itself around the technology. Oscar Nadell owned a small shop on Cortlandt Street. He sold components, repaired sets, and knew the inventory of every store within 3 blocks. His father had worked the same corner. On a morning in 1962, a man in a suit knocked on the glass door and handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter explaining that the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey had determined the land beneath his shop was needed for a development project. The letter used words like renewal and progress. It did not use the word negotiation. Radio Row covered roughly 16 acres, a dense grid of more than 300 small businesses employing 13,000 people. The neighborhood was informal, improvised, alive in ways that made urban planners uncomfortable. There were no corporate headquarters, no marble lobbies, no unified vision, as it was the opposite of what powerful men in the 1960s imagined when they thought about the future, and that made it vulnerable. The Port Authority was not a private developer. It was a government agency created in 1921 to manage transportation infrastructure across 2 states. It controlled bridges, tunnels, airports, and port facilities. It answered to no mayor, no city council, no electorate. It raised money through bonds, operated outside normal municipal oversight, and possessed a legal weapon that private developers could only dream of: eminent domain. When the Port Authority decided land was needed for public use, the land could be taken. Owners would be compensated at a price the authority deemed fair. The courts rarely intervened. David Rockefeller did not create the Port Authority, but he understood how to use it. As president of Chase Manhattan Bank, he watched corporations leave Lower Manhattan for Midtown and the suburbs. The financial district was aging, crowded, and losing its dominance. Rockefeller wanted a project bold enough to reverse the tide, and he needed a partner with the legal power to make it happen. The partnership was elegant in its simplicity. Rockefeller provided the vision and political connections. The Port Authority provided the muscle. The plan called for a World Trade Center, a complex of office towers that would reclaim New York's role as the center of global commerce. To build it, Radio Row would have to go. The displacement was framed as inevitable. a small sacrifice for the greater good. Officials spoke about blight and obsolescence, words that transformed living businesses into problems awaiting solutions. Newspaper editorials debated the merits. Some celebrated the ambition. Others questioned whether erasing a neighborhood to build office space constituted public use. Oscar Nadell did not care about the legal theory. He cared about the lease his father had signed, the customers who knew where to find him, and the rent he had just paid for the next 6 months. When he tried to argue, he was told the decision had already been made. When he asked for more compensation, he was handed forms to fill out. The process had the texture of democracy, but the outcome of decree. By 1966, the demolition crews arrived. Store owners packed what they could carry and abandoned what they could not. Some filed lawsuits that delayed the work by months but changed nothing. The buildings came down floor by floor, block by block. Radio Row disappeared into rubble and dust. The men with clipboards moved on to other projects. The neighborhood that had hummed with commerce and argument became a hole in the ground, waiting for the vision to fill it. The question was never whether the towers would rise. The question was whether anyone would remember what had been erased to make room for them. Rockefeller's promise, city's quiet rage. He did not sell a building, he sold a rescue, and the city learned the rescue came with strings. David Rockefeller understood that cities are built on confidence as much as concrete. In the early 1960s, Lower Manhattan was losing both. Office vacancy rates climbed. Commuters complained about aging subway stations and crowded streets. And corporate headquarters relocated to Park Avenue and beyond, chasing newer buildings and easier access. The financial district, once the undisputed center of American commerce, was becoming a place people left at 5 o'clock. Rockefeller did not see a neighborhood in decline. He saw an opportunity to rewrite the narrative. If the right project could be built, if the scale was dramatic enough, the symbolism clear enough, corporations would return. The city would remember why it mattered. The plan required more than architecture. It required belief. The World Trade Center was sold as salvation. Promotional materials emphasized global trade, international cooperation, and New York's destiny as a hub connecting continents. The rhetoric was grand, almost utopian. Officials promised thousands of jobs, revitalized streets, and a skyline that would awe the world. The message was clear. This was not just construction, it was rescue. But the rescue had architects, and the architects had motives. Rockefeller needed the project to succeed because his bank had invested heavily in downtown real estate. The Port Authority needed a marquee project to justify its existence and bond sales. Governor Nelson Rockefeller, David's brother, needed a legacy that would cement his political standing. The incentives aligned perfectly, and the alignment made dissent irrelevant. Labor unions raised concerns about displacement and wage guarantees. Neighborhood groups protested the scale and the secrecy of planning meetings. Journalists questioned whether the Port Authority, an agency designed to manage bridges and tunnels, had any business becoming the city's largest landlord. The criticisms were loud enough to make headlines, but not loud enough to stop bulldozers. The design itself became a point of friction. Architect Minoru Yamasaki proposed twin towers, each rising 110 stories, taller than any building in the world. The towers would be identical, a statement of symmetry and ambition. They would dominate the skyline in a way no single building could. Critics called the design arrogant, a monument to ego disguised as economic development. Supporters called it visionary. The debate raged in editorial pages, planning commission meetings and bar conversations across the city. What few people understood at the time was the financial absurdity of the proposal. The towers would contain more than 10 million square feet of office space. That was more than existed in many American cities. The Port Authority projected healthy occupancy rates and steady rental income, but the projections were optimistic to the point of fantasy. No comprehensive market study supported the scale. The assumption was that if you build something grand enough, tenants will come because they have to. Behind the public optimism, private doubts festered. Real estate analysts questioned whether downtown could support that much new space. Developers worried the Port Authority would undercut private rents to fill floors. Small business owners, already displaced, watched the excavation with a mixture of anger and resignation. The towers were being built not because the market demanded them, but because powerful men had decided the market could be shaped to fit the vision. The groundbreaking took place in 1966. Cameras captured officials in hard hats turning ceremonial shovels. Speeches celebrated ambition and progress. The narrative was carefully managed. This was the future, and the future had arrived. What the cameras did not capture was the resentment building in the streets, the lawsuits still grinding through courts, and the quiet fear that the city had made a bet it could not afford to lose. New York did not love the towers. It accepted them the way you accept a house guest who arrives uninvited and insists on staying. The rescue was happening whether the city wanted it or not. Two titans rise, doubt grows louder, steel climbed into fog, and with every new floor the argument sharpened. Icon or insult, miracle or mistake. Construction began in earnest in 1968, and the scale became visible almost immediately. The foundation required a trench 70 feet deep, carved into bedrock and lined with a slurry wall to hold back the Hudson River. Workers excavated more than 1 million cubic yards of earth and rock. The dirt was barged to the edge of Manhattan and used to create 23 acres of new land that would become Battery Park City. The hole was so vast that people came to stare at it, trying to comprehend the ambition. The towers rose in a manner that defied traditional construction. Yamasaki's design used a tube frame system, with load-bearing steel columns forming the exterior walls. This allowed for open floor plans with minimal interior supports, maximizing rentable space. It also meant the buildings had no central core of heavy columns. The elevator shafts, stairwells, and utilities were clustered in the center. But the real strength was in the skin. From an engineering perspective, it was elegant. From a human perspective, it was unsettling. The towers were hollow in a way older skyscrapers were not. Each tower required 200,000 tons of steel. The columns were bolted together in sections, hoisted by cranes and locked into place. Iron workers balanced on beams hundreds of feet above the street, connecting pieces that weighed tons. The work was dangerous, and men died. 5 workers fell during construction. The deaths were noted in newspapers, mourned by families, and then absorbed into the larger story of progress. The city had always built upward at a cost. As the towers grew, so did the controversy. Architects debated the aesthetics. The design was minimalist, almost brutalist, with narrow windows and repetitive lines. Some praised the purity of form. Others called it sterile, a filing cabinet built at the scale of hubris. The towers did not blend into the skyline. They dominated it, twin monoliths that made every other building look small. From certain angles, they blocked the sun. From others, they seemed to float, disconnected from the ground. New Yorkers developed opinions. Taxi drivers complained about the traffic caused by construction. Office workers in nearby buildings resented the shadow. Artists painted the towers as symbols of corporate greed. Tourists began to gather, cameras in hand, documenting the rise of something unprecedented. The towers were not yet finished, and already they were divisive. The Port Authority's public relations machine worked overtime to manage the narrative. Press releases emphasized jobs created in technological innovation and international prestige. Officials gave tours to journalists, explaining the engineering marvels and the vision for global trade. The message was relentless. This was not just construction, it was history. But the numbers told a more complicated story. By 1970, with the first tower nearing completion, the Port Authority had spent over $400 million. That was double the original estimate. The cost overruns were blamed on inflation, design changes, and unforeseen complications. But the truth was simpler. The project had always been underestimated, both in cost and complexity. The agency issued new bonds to cover the gap, confident that rental income would eventually justify the expense. The first tenants began moving in during 1971, and even as construction continued on the upper floors. The Port Authority itself occupied significant space, a decision that raised eyebrows. If the towers were such a good investment, why was the builder its own anchor tenant? The agency explained that it was leading by example, demonstrating confidence in the project. Critics noted that it was also guaranteeing occupancy at a time when private tenants were hesitant. On August 6, 1973, the towers officially opened. Ribbon-cutting ceremonies featured speeches, champagne, and optimism. The buildings were christened One World Trade Center and Two World Trade Center, though everyone called them the Twin Towers. They stood 1,350 feet tall, the tallest buildings in the world. For a moment, the doubt seemed small against the achievement, but the moment did not last. The city looked up at the towers and saw something magnificent and something wrong. The architecture was stunning in its audacity, but it lacked warmth. The towers were powerful, but they did not invite affection. They were proof that New York could still build the impossible, and a reminder that the impossible often comes at a price the bill does not capture. The question was no longer whether the towers could be built. The question was whether anyone would want to work inside them. The empty floors. No one admits. The towers looked full from a distance, but inside, silence spread across office space that could not find tenants. The opening was supposed to mark the beginning of a new era. Instead, it revealed a problem the planners had hoped to avoid. There were not enough tenants to fill the towers. The buildings contained 10 million square feet of rentable space spread across 220 floors. That was more office space than existed in downtown Los Angeles. The Port Authority had gambled that corporations would rush to claim a piece of the world's tallest building. The market did not cooperate. By the end of 1973, occupancy rates hovered near 50%. Entire floors sat empty, lights off, carpets still smelling of fresh glue. The Port Authority leased space to itself and to government agencies, filling floors with workers who had no choice in the matter. Private companies were harder to convince. Rents were competitive, sometimes below market rate, but hesitation remained. The towers were new, unproven, and far from Midtown where most corporate headquarters had relocated. The vacancy problem was not just an inconvenience, it was a financial disaster. The Port Authority had issued bonds worth hundreds of millions of dollars, backed by the promise of rental income. If the towers could not generate revenue, the bonds would default, the agency's credit would collapse, and the political fallout would be severe. Officials did what institutions always do when faced with uncomfortable truths. They adjusted the narrative. Press releases emphasized progress and milestones. When a new tenant signed a lease, it was announced with fanfare. When floors remained empty, the silence was strategic. The Port Authority offered incentives, reduced rents, customized build-outs, flexible lease terms. Some companies took the deals, moving in reluctantly. Others stayed away, unconvinced that downtown was the future. The numbers told a story the officials would not. Each tower was designed to hold 50,000 workers. At full capacity, the complex would employ 100,000 people, more than lived in many American towns. The buildings needed 450,000 square feet of window glass, 43,000 doors, and enough electrical wiring to stretch from New York to Chicago. The scale was staggering, and the scale was the problem. The towers were not built for the market that existed. They were built for a market the planners believed they could create. Elevator systems became a bottleneck. The buildings used a sky lobby system, where express elevators carried passengers to transfer floors on the 44th and 78th stories. Then local elevators continued to individual floors. The design saved space and reduced the number of shafts, but it also meant delays. Workers complained about waiting, about crowding, about the claustrophobia of riding in packed cars. The efficiency that looked brilliant on paper felt oppressive in practice. Maintenance costs mounted. The towers required their own zip code, their own power substation, and a small army of workers to keep systems running. Cleaning crews worked overnight, polishing miles of glass and vacuuming acres of carpet. Engineers monitored heating, cooling, water, and elevators. Security guards patrolled empty floors, their footsteps echoing in spaces designed for hundreds. Every empty floor was a liability, a cost that had to be covered even as it generated no income. The Port Authority denied there was a crisis. Officials pointed to long-term projections, to deals in negotiation, to the symbolic value of the towers. They argued that occupancy would improve as the market adjusted, as downtown regained its footing, as the vision proved itself. The argument was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely honest either. The towers were struggling, and everyone who worked there knew it. Journalists began to dig. Articles appeared questioning the optimism, citing industry experts who doubted the towers would ever reach profitable occupancy. The stories were framed as skepticism, not scandal, but the implication was clear. The World Trade Center was a monument to miscalculation. The Port Authority responded with more press releases, more tours, more speeches about global trade and New York's future. The machinery of persuasion worked tirelessly to drown out the empty floors. By 1975, occupancy had improved slightly, but not enough. The towers were iconic, but they were also a burden. They had reshaped the skyline and drained the budget. They were proof of what power could build and what power could not make people want. The silence inside those empty floors was not just the absence of workers. It was the sound of a bet going wrong, of a vision colliding with reality, and of a city learning that monuments do not pay their own bills. Fires, arson whispers, and the curse story. When flames ran through the building in the 1970s, New York did what it always does. It made a darker story. On February 13, 1975, fire broke out on the 11th floor of the North Tower. The blaze started in a storage area filled with office supplies, furniture, and flammable materials. By the time firefighters arrived, flames were visible through the windows, and smoke was rising through the elevator shafts. The fire burned for more than 3 hours, spreading across multiple floors, despite the supposed fireproofing. It took more than 200 firefighters to contain it. The damage was extensive. Entire sections of the floor were gutted. Steel beams warped from the heat. Fireproofing materials sprayed onto the structure during construction proved less effective than advertised. The fire revealed vulnerabilities that engineers had not anticipated or had chosen to ignore. Investigations later determined that the fireproofing had been applied unevenly, cut corners during installation, leaving gaps where steel was exposed. The cost savings had seemed minor at the time. Now they were written in charred metal. The official cause was never definitively determined. Reports suggested electrical malfunction or accidental ignition, but no single source was confirmed. In the absence of certainty, rumors filled the gap. Arson became a whispered theory. The logic was brutal but not illogical. The towers were struggling financially, occupancy was low, and insurance payouts could relieve pressure. No evidence supported the claim, but evidence was not required for speculation. The story spread through bars, construction sites, and late-night conversations. New York has always loved a curse. The city thrives on superstition layered over infrastructure, myth built into the grid. After the fire, people began to talk. Radio Row had been destroyed to make room for the towers. Businesses erased. Livelihoods ended. What if the displacement had left a stain, a karmic debt the buildings could not escape? The curse narrative was absurd, poetic, and emotionally satisfying. It gave shape to unease. Paranormal enthusiasts pointed to the timing. The towers had opened in 1973. The fire happened in 75. 2 years was long enough to suggest the trouble was not a fluke. Others noted that construction workers had died during the build. 5 men fell. Maybe their deaths lingered in the steel, in the concrete, in the foundation dug into land that once belonged to others. The argument was folklore, not fact, but folklore does not need facts to feel true. Skeptics offered grounded explanations. The towers were massive, complex systems where failures were statistically inevitable. Maintenance was expensive, budgets were tight, and shortcuts were taken. Fireproofing was only as good as its application, and application was done by the lowest bidder working under deadline. Electrical systems aged faster than expected. Security was inconsistent. The fire was not a curse. It was the predictable result of cost-cutting and scale. Both stories circulated. The curse satisfied the need for meaning. The structural explanation satisfied the need for accountability. Neither could be proven absolutely, and so both survived. The Port Authority leaned into the practical narrative, commissioning studies and upgrading fire safety protocols. Sprinkler systems were improved. Fireproofing was inspected and reapplied. Officials assured the public that lessons had been learned. But the improvements came after the fire, not before. That timing mattered. It suggested the safety measures were reactive, not proactive. The towers had been built with efficiency prioritized over redundancy. The fire exposed that choice, and the exposure was uncomfortable. The question was not whether the towers could survive a fire. The question was whether they had been designed with survival in mind. Other incidents followed. In 1977, a small fire broke out in a telephone switching room. In 1978, there was smoke reported on the 65th floor. Each event was minor compared to the 75 blaze, but each added to the pattern. The towers were not just tall, they were vulnerable. And vulnerability at that scale was terrifying. The curse story persisted because it named the fear people felt but could not articulate. The towers were unnatural in their size, in their dominance, in their indifference to the neighborhood they replaced. They felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with presence. Whether you believed in curses or not, the buildings carried weight beyond their physical mass. Fire became part of the tower's identity. Not the spectacle of flame, but the possibility of it. The knowledge that somewhere in the maze of steel and glass and drywall, something could ignite. That evacuation would be slow, that the height which made the towers iconic also made them traps. The Port Authority never acknowledged the curse. Officials dismissed it as urban legend, the kind of story bored people tell to make buildings more interesting. But dismissal is not the same as resolution. The fires happened. The vulnerabilities were real, and the towers continued to stand, proof that power can build anything, even monuments to its own fragility. The fatal bargain called efficiency, somewhere between budget meetings and engineering pride, safety became negotiable, and that choice waited patiently for its moment. The towers were designed with efficiency as a guiding principle. Efficiency in structure, in layout, in cost. Every decision was made to maximize rentable space and minimize waste. The tube frame system used exterior columns to bear the load, eliminating the need for heavy interior supports. The sky lobby system reduced the number of elevator shafts, freeing up square footage. The open floor plans allowed tenants to configure space however they wanted. On paper, the design was brilliant. In practice, it created constraints that would prove deadly. Evacuation was the most obvious problem. The towers had only 3 stairwells each, narrow and clustered in the central core. For a building housing 50,000 people per tower, 3 stairwells was barely adequate under normal conditions. Under emergency conditions, it was a bottleneck. Fire codes at the time did not mandate more, and adding stairwells would have reduced rentable space. The Port Authority chose efficiency. The occupants would live with the choice. Each stairwell was pressurized to prevent smoke infiltration, but the system depended on doors remaining closed. If a door was propped open, or if the pressurization failed, smoke could fill the stairs within minutes. The stairwells themselves were narrow, designed to meet minimum code requirements, not to exceed them. 2 people could not comfortably pass each other. In a panic, with thousands trying to descend, the stairs would clog. Fireproofing was another compromise. The original design called for thicker coatings, but budget pressures led to adjustments. Contractors sprayed lightweight fireproofing material onto steel beams, but the application was uneven. Some beams received less coating than specified. Others were skipped entirely. Inspections were inconsistent, and deadlines were tight. The assumption was that fire suppression systems would handle any blaze before the steel was compromised. The assumption ignored the possibility of overwhelming fire or system failure. Emergency lighting was adequate, but not redundant. Backup generators existed, but they served critical systems first. Stairwells would have light, but not indefinitely. The assumption was that evacuations would proceed in an orderly manner, guided by training and clear signage. The assumption did not account for panic, for darkness, for smoke obscuring exit signs. Communication systems were fragmented. The Port Authority police had their own radios. The New York Fire Department used a different system. The two could not communicate directly during emergencies. Coordination required relay messages, delays, and hope that information would not be lost in translation. The problem was known, documented, and never fully resolved. The cost of upgrading the system competed with other priorities, and other priorities won. The towers were built during a period of optimism about technology. Computers would manage building systems. Sensors would detect problems early, and automated systems would respond faster than humans. The faith in technology was not misplaced, but it was incomplete. Technology fails. Sensors malfunction. Automation freezes. The towers had backups, but the backups assumed failures would be isolated, manageable, and brief. The design also assumed that occupants would be trained. Fire drills were conducted periodically, teaching workers to use the stairwells and proceed to designated assembly areas. But compliance was voluntary, participation was inconsistent, and turnover was high. New employees arrived constantly, many never experiencing a drill. The assumption that training would create preparedness was optimistic at best. The Port Authority was aware of the constraints. Internal memos discussed evacuation times, stairwell capacity, and fire response protocols. But awareness did not lead to action. Fixing the problems would require retrofitting both towers, disrupting tenants, and spending money that was already committed elsewhere. The decision was made implicitly. The risks were acceptable as long as they remained theoretical. Engineers who worked on the project later admitted the trade-offs. They defended the decisions as rational within the context of the time. Codes were followed, standards were met. The towers were no worse than other skyscrapers being built in the same era. That was true, but it was also insufficient. The towers were not like other buildings. Their scale magnified every vulnerability. A problem that would be minor in a 20-story building became catastrophic at 110 stories. The point of no return was not a single decision. It was a series of small choices, each defensible in isolation, that accumulated into a structure where safety was compromised by design. The towers were monuments to ambition, but they were also monuments to the belief that efficiency could substitute for redundancy, that cost savings justified risk, and that the future would forgive the shortcuts of the present. The bargain was simple: build faster, build cheaper, and trust that nothing would go catastrophically wrong. For years, the bargain held. The towers stood, the tenants worked, and the risks remained hidden in emergency plans that were never fully tested. The safety measures that existed were adequate for ordinary days, but the towers were not built for ordinary days. They were built to dominate the skyline, to reshape the city, to prove that nothing was impossible. And somewhere in that ambition, in the drive to build higher and grander, the margin for error disappeared. The towers were locked into their vulnerabilities, written into the steel and concrete. The choice had been made. Now it was just a matter of time before the choice revealed its cost. Crime finds a home in marble. Beneath the polished plaza, the complex developed a second life, one the brochures never described. The World Trade Center was more than 2 towers. It was a 16-acre complex spanning 7 buildings, connected by an underground concourse that stretched beneath the plaza. The concourse was designed as a shopping and transit hub, linking subway lines and PATH trains to the towers above. It was meant to be convenient, modern, and safe. Instead, it became something darker. The concourse operated 24 hours a day, a labyrinth of hallways, shops, and service corridors that never fully closed. Commuters passed through during rush hours, flooding the tunnels with movement and noise. But at night, after the shop shut their gates and the workers went home, the concourse emptied. What remained was space without oversight, a maze where people could disappear. Crime found the gaps quickly. Pickpockets worked the morning crowds, targeting tourists and distracted commuters. Shoplifting was constant, small thefts that added up over weeks. Security cameras existed, but coverage was incomplete. Guards patrolled, but the concourse was too large to monitor continuously. Thieves learned the blind spots, the timing of patrols, the exits that led to street-level anonymity. Muggings happened in stairwells and service corridors, places where foot traffic thinned. A person walking alone could be cornered, robbed, and left before anyone noticed. The attacks were not frequent enough to make headlines, but they were common enough to build a reputation. Workers began avoiding certain areas after dark. Women who worked late would leave in groups, unwilling to walk the concourse alone. The Port Authority police force was responsible for security, but the force was small relative to the size of the complex. The concourse alone covered more than 400,000 square feet, with dozens of entrances and connections to the subway system. Policing that space required manpower the agency did not have, and a budget it was unwilling to expand. Patrols were visible during business hours, reassuring but shallow. After hours, the presence thinned, and homeless populations found shelter in the concourse during winter. The tunnels were warmer than the streets, and the bathrooms provided basic facilities. Security would clear people out periodically, but they returned. The complex was too large and too connected to seal completely. The homeless were not the source of crime, but their presence added to the sense of disorder. The plaza above was pristine, corporate, controlled. The concourse below was messy, unpredictable, and impossible to fully manage. Drug dealing operated in the margins. Small transactions, quick handoffs, nothing dramatic enough to draw major police attention, but persistent enough to create a market. The buyers were often workers from the towers, people looking for something to smooth the edges of long days in fluorescent office light. The sellers were opportunistic, in operating in the flow of commuters where a transaction could look like any other brief conversation. The scale of the complex worked against security. The plaza above covered 16 acres. The concourse below mirrored that footprint, threading beneath streets and connecting buildings. There were more than 40,000 doors in the complex, hundreds of exits, and multiple subway connections that brought in thousands of people each day. Controlling access was impossible. Anyone could walk in, anyone could walk out. The openness that made the complex a transit hub also made it a security nightmare. Violent crime was rare, but not absent. In 1978, a woman was assaulted in a stairwell. In 1980, a robbery turned into a stabbing near the PATH station. Each incident prompted temporary increases in patrols, and then a gradual return to baseline staffing. The pattern repeated: crisis, response, complacency. New Yorkers developed a mental map of the city that included risk zones, places to avoid or move through quickly. The World Trade Center concourse earned a spot on that map. It was not the most dangerous place in the city, but it was unpredictable in a way that made people uneasy. The towers above were symbols of corporate power. The tunnels below were reminders that no amount of marble and steel could erase the city's disorder. The Port Authority tried to manage perception. Marketing emphasized the plaza, the views, the restaurants, the observation deck. The concourse was presented as a convenience, a modern amenity. Crime statistics were not advertised. Incidents were downplayed or attributed to the larger urban environment, yet not to failures in design or security. But the workers knew. They lived with the concourse daily, navigating its corridors and learning which corners to avoid. The unease became part of the complex's identity, a shadow that did not appear in promotional photographs, but shaped how people experienced the space. The plaza above was designed to be iconic, a stage for New York to perform its ambition. The concourse below was designed to be functional, a network of circulation and commerce. What it became was proof that grandeur and dysfunction could coexist, that a complex could be both a marvel and a problem, and that the bill for poor planning gets paid by the people who work there, one uncomfortable walk at a time. The towers wanted to be monuments. The concourse reminded everyone they were also just buildings, subject to the same failures and fears as any other place where people gather and systems break down. The bomb that warned then faded. In the early 1990s, smoke and terror proved the towers could be attacked, and the lesson did not stick. February 26, 1993. A yellow Ryder truck descended into the underground parking garage beneath the North Tower. Inside the truck was a bomb, 1,200 pounds of urea nitrate mixed with nitroglycerin, packed into wooden crates. The driver parked near a structural column, lit a fuse, and walked away. At 12:17 in the afternoon, the bomb detonated. The explosion tore through 6 stories of concrete. It created a crater 30 feet deep and 150 feet wide. The blast killed 6 people and injured more than 1,000. Smoke poured into the towers through elevator shafts and stairwells, filling offices with toxic air. Power failed across the complex. Emergency lighting flickered on, then died. 50,000 people were inside the buildings when the bomb went off. Evacuation began immediately, but moved slowly. The stairwells were dark, crowded, and filling with smoke. People descended in near-total blackness, touching walls to find their way. Some carried flashlights or lighters. Others followed voices, trusting strangers to guide them down. The descent took hours. Pregnant women, elderly workers, and people with disabilities struggled to keep pace. Some were carried. Some gave up and waited in stairwells, hoping rescue would arrive. Firefighters climbed the stairs as occupants descended, hauling equipment and searching for injured. The radios did not work properly. Communication between units broke down. Commanders on the ground lost contact with teams inside. The response was brave and chaotic, improvised on the spot by people doing their best in conditions they had never trained for. By evening, the towers were evacuated. The dead were identified. The injured were treated. The investigation began. The FBI traced the truck to a rental agency. Surveillance footage showed the driver. Within days, arrests were made. The bombing was not random. It was planned, deliberate, an act of terrorism intended to kill thousands. The conspirators wanted to topple the North Tower into the South Tower, collapsing both and killing everyone inside. The plan failed because the bomb was not powerful enough, and the towers were stronger than the bombers understood. But the attempt revealed a vulnerability that should have been obvious. The towers could be attacked. Their height made them targets. Their symbolism made them desirable targets, and their design made them difficult to defend. Security was upgraded after the attack. Vehicle access to the parking garage was restricted. Barriers were installed. ID checks became routine. The Port Authority hired more police and invested in surveillance systems. The improvements were real, but they were also incomplete. The fundamental problem remained. The towers were too large to secure completely. There were too many entrances, too many people, too many ways for someone with intent to cause harm. The psychological impact was profound, but temporary. For weeks after the bombing, workers hesitated to return. Some quit. Others requested transfers. The towers felt dangerous in a way they had not before. The reassurances from officials, the promises of improved security, could not erase the memory of smoke and darkness and the hours spent descending stairs, not knowing if the building would hold. But memory fades. Months passed. The damaged floors were repaired. The garage was rebuilt. Workers returned. New tenants signed leases. The towers resumed their place in the skyline, and the bombing became a story people told about the past, not a warning about the future. Prophecy narratives emerged in the years after. People claimed they had felt something before the attack, a sense of dread or unease. Others reported dreams of disaster weeks earlier. The claims were anecdotal, unprovable, and emotionally resonant. They gave shape to fear, turning randomness into fate. Skeptics pointed out that prophecy talk always emerges after tragedy. Memory is unreliable. People conflate feelings with premonition. The bombing was not foretold. It was planned by men with explosives and a truck, not by forces beyond comprehension. The rational explanation was sufficient, but both narratives coexisted. The prophecy satisfied a need to believe that disaster can be anticipated, that warning signs exist if only we pay attention. The rational explanation satisfied a need to believe that the world operates on logic, that events have causes we can identify and address. The bombing should have rewritten policy. It should have led to comprehensive reviews of evacuation procedures, structural vulnerabilities, and emergency response coordination. Some changes were made, but they were reactive and limited. The towers were too expensive to retrofit fully. Tenants could not be displaced for months of construction. The political will to force major changes did not exist. So the lessons were learned and then forgotten. Reports were filed. Recommendations were made. Some were implemented. Others were shelved. The towers returned to normal, and normal meant accepting risks that were now documented and ignored. 8 years later, the lesson would return. But in 1993, in the aftermath of smoke and fear, the city chose to believe the towers were safe enough. The attack had failed. The system had held. The future would be different because security was better, and surely no one would try again. The bomb warned. The institution nodded, and the warning dissolved into the rhythm of daily life. It filed away with other close calls that seemed less urgent once the smoke cleared. The lease that sold a meth. Right before the end, the towers were packaged like a mature asset, as if history could be signed away with ink. By the late 1990s, the Port Authority wanted out. The World Trade Center had become a financial and operational burden. Occupancy had improved since the early years, but the buildings were aging. Maintenance costs were rising. Competition from newer office towers in Midtown and Jersey City was intense. The complex generated revenue, but it also consumed resources and attention the Port Authority preferred to direct elsewhere. Privatization became the solution. The agency would lease the towers to a private developer, transferring operational responsibility while retaining ownership of the land. The lease would generate a lump sum payment, relieving the Port Authority of day-to-day management and unlocking capital for other projects. The pitch was clean. The private sector could run the complex more efficiently, and the public agency could focus on transportation infrastructure. The lease process began in 2000. Bids were solicited. Developers evaluated the opportunity. The numbers were staggering. The World Trade Center complex included 10 million square feet of office space, a retail concourse, and land rights that extended deep into lower Manhattan's bedrock. The lease was not just for the Twin Towers. It covered the entire 16-acre site, 7 buildings, and all the infrastructure that kept them running. Larry Silverstein, a New York real estate developer, led the winning bid. His offer was $3.2 billion for a 99-year lease. The deal closed in July 2001. Silverstein assumed control of the complex, responsible for rent collection, tenant relations, maintenance, and all operating costs. In exchange, he gained the rights to one of the most iconic properties in the world. The financial terms were complex. Silverstein's group financed the deal through a combination of equity and debt. The Port Authority received its payment up front. Insurance policies were purchased to cover potential losses, including terrorism coverage, a standard provision in commercial real estate, but one that would prove critical. The lease agreement ran to thousands of pages, detailing rights, obligations, and contingencies for scenarios no one seriously expected. The transaction was framed as a success. The Port Authority celebrated the deal as smart asset management. Silverstein touted the opportunity to modernize and optimize the complex. Press coverage was positive, noting the lease as evidence of Lower Manhattan's resilience and the enduring value of the towers. The deal was logical, well-structured, and completed just 6 weeks before everything changed. The scale of the complex was almost incomprehensible. The towers alone required 14,000 windows cleaned on a rotating schedule. The elevator system transported 50,000 people daily, moving vertically the equivalent of climbing Mount Everest dozens of times each day. The complex consumed enough electricity to power a small city. It generated 100,000 tons of trash annually. The concourse beneath the plaza connected to 12 subway lines and served 200,000 commuters each day. Operating costs ran to hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Staffing included security, maintenance, janitorial, engineering, and administrative personnel. The towers needed constant attention. HVAC systems, elevators, fire suppression, plumbing, electrical grids, all operating at a scale few buildings could match. The cost of replacing a single elevator cable ran to tens of thousands of dollars. Repairing facade damage required cranes, specialized labor, and weeks of coordination. Every system was expensive to maintain, and every system was critical. The lease bet on stability. Silverstein's projections assumed steady occupancy, predictable rent growth, and manageable operating expenses. The towers were mature assets, their risks known and priced in. The assumption was that the complex would continue operating as it had for nearly 30 years, iconic, profitable, and permanent. The insurance policies reflected that assumption. Coverage was structured around conventional risks: fire, storm damage, equipment failure. Terrorism coverage was included, but treated as a formality, a box to check rather than a genuine expectation. The premiums reflected that logic. The towers had been attacked once, in '93, and the system had held. Security had been improved. The likelihood of another attack seemed remote. The lease closed on July 24, 2001. Silverstein took control of the complex. Keys were transferred, contracts were signed, and the responsibility shifted from public agency to private developer. The transition was smooth, unprofessional, and utterly routine. 49 days later, the towers were gone. The lease did not sell a building. It sold a belief. that the towers were permanent, that their value was secure, that the future would resemble the past. The paperwork was meticulous, the financing was solid, and the logic was sound. Every calculation assumed tomorrow would be like yesterday, only slightly better. The assumption was wrong. The towers were not mature assets. They were monuments on borrowed time, standing at the intersection of ambition, vulnerability, and a world that was changing faster than contracts could anticipate. The lease packaged the towers as property, but property can only be owned when it survives. And survival was never guaranteed, no matter how many pages the lawyers wrote. The morning that rewrote every argument. After September 11th, the old complaints sounded small, yet they carried a painful truth about warning signs ignored. The towers fell on a Tuesday morning. 2 planes, 19 hijackers, and a plan executed with precision. The first plane struck the North Tower at 8:46. The second hit the South Tower at 9:03. By 10:28, both towers had collapsed. 2,753 people died. The attacks were not a failure of vision. They were a failure of response to vision. The 1993 bombing had demonstrated that the towers could be targeted. Security had been upgraded, but the upgrades assumed threats would come from the ground. No one had seriously planned for airplanes used as weapons. The scenario seemed too extreme, too cinematic, too unlikely. The evacuation exposed every design flaw the towers had carried since construction. The stairwells were too narrow. 3 stairwells per tower was inadequate for 50,000 occupants. Smoke filled the stairs within minutes. Emergency lighting failed. Radios did not work. Coordination between police and fire departments broke down. People above the impact zones were trapped, unable to descend through walls of fire and debris. Firefighters climbed the stairs carrying equipment, passing evacuees who were descending. The climb was slow, exhausting, and ultimately futile. Communication with commanders on the ground was intermittent. Orders were unclear. By the time the South Tower collapsed, hundreds of firefighters were still inside the North Tower. They had no warning. The building came down, and they were gone. The collapse itself was a consequence of design. The tube frame structure, so efficient in maximizing rentable space, concentrated the load on exterior columns and a central core. When the planes severed columns and ignited fires that weakened the steel, the floors above the impact zone lost support. They fell, and the weight of their fall overwhelmed the floors below. The cascade was rapid, total, and unstoppable. The fireproofing that had been applied unevenly during construction could not protect steel exposed to prolonged fire. The narrow stairwells became death traps. The sky lobby system that saved space created bottlenecks. Every efficiency, every cost saving, every design choice made to maximize profit and minimize construction time contributed to the magnitude of the disaster. The city's grief was immediate and overwhelming, but beneath the grief was anger. The towers had been built with warnings ignored. The 93 bombing had proven the complex was a target. Internal reports had identified evacuation vulnerabilities. Fire safety experts had questioned the adequacy of stairwells and fireproofing. Every concern had been noted, filed, and deprioritized. The old complaints about the towers, the resentment over Radio Row, the criticisms of cost overruns and empty floors, the unease about crime in the concourse, all of it sounded petty after September 11th. But the complaints had been symptoms of a deeper problem. The towers were built for ambition, not for the people who would occupy them. Safety was negotiable. Public input was irrelevant. The project moved forward because power decided it would, and power did not listen to warnings. The question was not whether the towers could have been saved on September 11th. The question was whether the vulnerabilities that made the collapse so catastrophic could have been addressed earlier. The answer was yes. The fireproofing could have been applied correctly. The stairwells could have been wider and more numerous. Emergency communication systems could have been integrated. Evacuation drills could have been mandatory and frequent. None of those changes would have prevented the attacks, but they might have saved lives. They might have allowed more people to escape. They might have given firefighters a chance to retreat before the collapse. The difference between might and certainty is unknowable, but the failure to try is not. The towers were monuments to the belief that grandeur excuses compromise. They were proof that power can build anything, even structures that cannot protect the people inside them. And they were a lesson, written in steel and fire and loss, that warnings ignored do not disappear. They wait. After September 11th, every decision made during the planning, construction, and operation of the towers was re-examined. The cost-cutting, the lobbying, the displacement of Radio Row, the refusal to retrofit after '93. All of it became part of the story, not as trivia, but as accountability. The city understood too late that the towers were not just buildings. They were choices made by people with power, imposed on a city that had little say, and maintained by institutions that prioritized image over safety. The towers fell because they were attacked, but they fell the way they did because of how they were built, and who decided that how they were built was good enough. Ground zero, real estate, and memory wars. When the smoke cleared, a new fight began, not over height, but over who owned the story. The site became known as Ground Zero, 16 acres of rubble, twisted steel, and ash. The cleanup took 9 months. Workers removed more than 1 million tons of debris, searching for remains, salvaging artifacts, and clearing the land. The work was somber, sacred, and also practical. The site was valuable, and the question of what to replace the towers consumed the city. Silverstein still held the lease. The deal, signed 6 weeks before the attacks, obligated him to rebuild. Insurance policies would cover the loss, but the policies became the subject of litigation. Silverstein argued that 2 planes constituted 2 separate attacks, triggering 2 payouts. Insurers argued it was a single coordinated event, 1 payout. The legal battle stretched for years. Billions of dollars hung on the interpretation of contract language. The public wanted a memorial. Families of victims demanded that the footprints of the towers remain untouched, sacred ground where no commerce would occur. Architects proposed designs, reflecting pools, gardens, museums. The emotional weight of the site was undeniable, but so was its commercial value. 16 acres in Lower Manhattan represented opportunity, revenue, and the symbolic restoration of the skyline. The debate fractured into camps. Preservationists wanted the entire site dedicated to memory. Developers wanted office towers rebuilt, as a proof that New York would not be intimidated. Politicians wanted both, a compromise that would honor the dead and restore economic vitality. The friction was not polite. Public meetings turned into shouting matches. Editorials accused opponents of greed or sentimentality. The site became a battleground where grief and capitalism collided. Paranormal narratives returned. People reported feeling presence at the site, a heaviness that could not be explained by rubble alone. Construction workers spoke of unease, of areas where the air felt different. Paranormal investigators conducted vigils, claiming to document voices, shadows, and anomalies on recording equipment. The stories were anecdotal, unverified, and emotionally potent. Skeptics offered context. Trauma leaves psychological imprints. The site had witnessed unimaginable loss. The human mind seeks patterns, meaning, and connection to the dead. Feelings of presence are common in places associated with tragedy. The explanations were compassionate but not dismissive. Haunting, whether literal or metaphorical, was real to those who experienced it. The memorial design was chosen through an international competition. The winning proposal featured 2 recessed pools set within the footprints of the towers, waterfalls cascading into voids that could never be filled. The names of the dead would be inscribed around the edges. The design was elegant, mournful, and powerful. It treated the site as hallowed ground. But the memorial was only part of the plan. The rest of the site would be redeveloped. New office towers would rise, smaller than the originals, but significant. The Freedom Tower, later renamed One World Trade Center, would become the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, a symbolic reclaiming of the skyline. Retail space would be rebuilt. Transit connections would be restored. The site would be both cemetery and marketplace. The tension was fundamental. Memory cannot be monetized without diminishing it. Commerce cannot be exiled from valuable land without economic consequences. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but it allowed the project to move forward. Ground was broken on the memorial in 2006. The museum opened in 2014. One World Trade Center was completed in 2013, its height chosen deliberately, 1,776 feet, a nod to the year of American independence. The rebuilding was slower and more expensive than anticipated, and disputes over design, funding, and jurisdiction delayed progress. The Port Authority, Silverstein, the city, and the federal government all had competing interests and overlapping authority. Coordination required endless negotiation. Deadlines were missed, budgets ballooned. The site became a symbol not just of resilience, but of bureaucratic dysfunction. Visitors came to Ground Zero in millions. Tourists photographed the memorial. Families left flowers and flags. The site became pilgrimage, a place where people came to remember, to grieve, and to try to make sense of loss. But it also became commerce. Nearby vendors sold memorabilia, restaurants filled with visitors, hotels advertised proximity to the site. The sanctity was real, and so was the economy built around it. The question haunting the site was whether memory and commerce could coexist without corrupting each other. The answer was uncomfortable. They could coexist, but not cleanly. The memorial was beautiful and sincere. The office towers were necessary and lucrative. The site was both, and the friction between the two was the price of moving forward. Haunted ground, whether understood literally or metaphorically, does not forget. The towers fell, the dead were mourned, and the site was rebuilt. But the rebuilding did not erase what happened. It layered new meaning over old trauma, creating a place where the past and future occupy the same 16 acres, uncomfortable neighbors that cannot be separated. The story of the site after September 11th was not a story of closure. It was a story of compromise, conflict, and the difficult truth that cities must rebuild even when the ground still feels sacred. The memory wars were not won. They were negotiated imperfectly, and the result was a place that honors the dead while serving the living. a balance that feels necessary and insufficient all at once. The empire built on ego and ruin. In the end, the towers left two legacies at once, a warning about power and a longing for what was lost. The towers stood for 28 years. In that time, they became icons, landmarks, and symbols of ambition. They reshaped the skyline, dominated photographs, and anchored the identity of Lower Manhattan. They were instantly recognizable, a shorthand for New York itself. And they were built on a foundation of displacement, cost-cutting, and decisions made by people who did not have to live with the consequences. In Radio Row is where the story begins and ends. The neighborhood was erased not because it was failing, but because it stood in the way. 300 small businesses, 13,000 jobs, a community built over decades. The owners were not consulted. They were notified. The compensation was inadequate. The displacement was sold as progress, as if progress justifies any cost. The towers rose where the shops had stood, and the city gained monuments but lost memory. The legacy of that choice is not abstract. It is written into how cities operate, how power makes decisions, and who gets heard when those decisions are made. Eminent domain is a tool that can serve the public good, but it can also serve ambition disguised as public good. The towers were sold as rescue, but the rescue was selective. It saved the financial district's image while erasing the people who made the district function. The towers were built to prove New York could still compete, could still build the impossible, could still dominate the global stage. They succeeded in that goal. But success came with costs that were not part of the sales pitch. The empty floors in the early years revealed that ambition does not always align with market reality. The fires exposed that efficiency and safety are not the same thing. The crime in the concourse showed that grandeur above does not eliminate disorder below. The 1993 bombing should have been a turning point. It proved the towers were targets. It demonstrated that evacuation was slow and dangerous. It revealed that security was inadequate for a structure that housed 50,000 people. The lesson was learned and then set aside. Reports were filed, improvements were made. But the fundamental vulnerabilities were not addressed. Retrofitting would have been expensive, disruptive, and politically complicated. So the towers continued as they were, and the risks remained. September 11th was not inevitable. But the way the towers fell, the speed of the collapse, the number of people trapped, those outcomes were shaped by choices made decades earlier. The tube frame design that maximized rentable space, the narrow stairwells that met minimum codes but not maximum safety, the fireproofing applied unevenly to save time and money. Every decision made sense within the logic of efficiency. None of them made sense within the logic of survival. The towers left two legacies. The first is a warning about power. Systems driven by ambition and leverage do not need public love to build. They need capital, legal authority, and a narrative that frames opposition as resistance to progress. The towers were built because powerful men decided they should be built, and the mechanisms existed to make that decision final. Public input was limited, public benefit was assumed, and public cost was ignored. The second legacy is longing. Despite everything, despite the displacement and the compromises and the tragedy, people miss the towers. They were beautiful in their starkness. They anchored the skyline in a way nothing else has. They were flawed, but they were ours. The longing is not for the towers as they were, but for what they represented before the fall. A belief that New York could build anything, that ambition had no ceiling, that the city's power was permanent. Both legacies are true. The towers were monuments to ego, built without consent, maintained without adequate care, and destroyed in a way that revealed every hidden flaw. And they were also beloved, missed, and mourned. The contradiction is not a puzzle to solve. It is the reality of how cities remember. The bill for ambition always arrives. Sometimes it comes quickly in the form of empty floors and financial strain. Sometimes it waits, accumulating interest, until a single morning rewrites every assumption. The towers were designed to last a century. They lasted 3 decades. The difference between design and reality is measured in the lives lost, the businesses displaced, and the warnings ignored. What does ambition owe the people it stands above? The question haunted Radio Row in 1962, and it haunts Ground Zero today. The answer is not simple. Ambition owes transparency, consent, and the humility to admit when grandeur is not worth the cost. It owes the willingness to listen, to retrofit, to change course when the evidence demands it. Ambition owes the acknowledgement that monuments are only as good as the care taken to protect the people who occupy them. The towers fell, but the systems that built them remain. Eminent domain still exists. Cost-cutting still competes with safety. Power still shapes cities according to visions that the public inherits but does not choose. The lesson of the towers is not that ambition should be abandoned. It is that ambition without accountability becomes ruin, and ruin does not care how impressive the architecture looked before it collapsed. In the end, the towers were an empire built on ego, constructed on the displacement of a neighborhood, compromised by efficiency, and destroyed by an attack that exploited every vulnerability the builders had accepted as tolerable risk. They were proof that you can build anything if you have the power, and they were proof that what you build will only stand as long as the choices that built it can hold. The city rebuilt. Memory and commerce share the same ground now, uncomfortable but inseparable. The new towers stand taller, gleaming in glass and steel, symbols of resilience. But resilience is not the same as wisdom. The question is not whether we can rebuild after disaster. The question is whether we will build differently, with consent, with care, and with the understanding that monuments are not measured by height alone, but by the honesty of their foundations.